Hello, my name is Landon Hayes. I'm 31 years old, a mechanical engineer living in Richmond, Virginia, in a two-story white-painted wooden house nestled in the heart of a working-class neighborhood in Chesterfield County. My life is nothing extraordinary. I go to work, come home, have dinner with my family, and sometimes sit on the porch watching the sunset, listening to the chirping of insects in the bushes. Simple, ordinary, and for me that's enough. But if you ask me what happiness is, I'd point to Addison, my younger sister. She is my entire world, the light in my darkest days, the reason I wake up every morning and work hard. As long as Addison is safe and chasing her dreams, I need nothing more. Our house isn't big, but it's warm. It sits on a quiet street surrounded by old oak trees about a 30-minute drive from downtown Richmond. My father, Harold Hayes, used to work in the railroad industry and is now retired. He often sits in his worn-out armchair in the living room reading the newspaper or muttering about the trains he once drove. He's kind but reserved, always carrying a vague worry about the world outside, a world of power that he says is never fair to people like us. My mother, Margaret, is the soul of the house. She works part-time at a small nearby grocery store, always bringing home little stories about customers, rainy days, or sunny weather. She believes in God, in kindness, but sometimes I see a fear in her eyes, a fear that this simple life and the two children she holds so dear could vanish at any moment. And Addison? Oh, Addison is the pride of our family. At 26, she's a young, intelligent, and gentle interior designer with an aesthetic sense that I, a practical, no-nonsense engineer, can never fully grasp. She has bright eyes, a radiant smile, and a big dream: to open her own studio called Hayes Interiors. I remember the nights she sat at the dining table, sketching designs, her hands moving across the paper as if telling a story. "Landon, one day I'll design the most beautiful homes in Richmond," she once said, her eyes sparkling like stars. I just smiled, ruffled her hair, and said, "I believe in you." I'm 5 years older than Addison, and ever since she was little, I've felt a responsibility to protect her. Our parents love us, but they were often busy, worn out from long work days. So I was the one who took Addison to school, bandaged her scrapes when she fell off her bike, and listened to her talk about her big dreams. Once, when she was 12, she asked me, "Landon, if I wanted to fly like a bird, would you make wings for me?" I burst out laughing, but that night I sat down and made a pair of wings out of cardboard, painted them silver, and hung them on her bedroom wall. Addison squealed with joy, hugged me tightly, and from that moment I knew I'd do anything to make her happy. Our life went on like that, quiet but fulfilling. Every evening the family gathered on the porch. Mom would make tea, Dad would recount old stories about his trains, and Addison would talk about her new designs or the quirky clients at her company. I'd usually just listen, occasionally teasing Addison until she pouted in mock anger. Those moments, to me, were everything. I don't need a big house, a fancy car, or fame. As long as my family is safe and Addison is smiling, my life feels worth living. But life, as I've come to realize, is never as simple as we hope. I still remember that afternoon when everything began to change. It was a fall day, the sky clear and blue, the oak leaves starting to turn a brilliant gold. I'd just come home from work, exhausted after a long day at the machine shop, the smell of engine oil still clinging to my clothes. As I walked into the house, I heard Mom humming softly in the kitchen. Addison wasn't home yet, which was a bit unusual since she's usually there before me. I asked Mom about it, and she just smiled. She's probably at the office, busy with her designs. I nodded, but a faint unease settled in my chest. Addison is always punctual, and if she's running late, she calls. That night, Addison came home late. I was sitting on the porch holding a cold cup of coffee when I saw the headlights of a car pull into the driveway. Addison stepped out, her hair loose and flowing, wearing a dark green dress I'd never seen before. She looked different, not the usual casual girl in a t-shirt and jeans. She was radiant, as if the whole world was opening up before her. "Landon," she called, her voice bright. "Why aren't you asleep? Waiting for me?" I frowned, trying to sound stern. Where were you coming home this late? Mom was worried. She laughed, her smile as bright as the moonlight. I was meeting a client. The company gave me a big project, Landon. A mansion in the West End. They want me to redesign the entire interior. I think this is my big break. I nodded, my unease easing slightly. Who's this client that's so important you're home late? She hesitated, then said softly, her voice like a breeze, Vincent Langford. He's the son of the chairman of Langford Holdings. Very polite, Landon. He said he loves my design style. Vincent Langford. That name right from the start gave me a bad feeling. Langford Holdings is one of the biggest corporations in Richmond, owning a slew of real estate, hotels, and projects that people like me only read about in the papers. I didn't know much about them, but I knew families like that. Powerful, wealthy, and often playing by rules that don't apply to people like us. But seeing the sparkle in Addison's eyes, I couldn't bring myself to say anything. I just patted her shoulder and said, "Good job. But next time, call ahead, okay?" I was worried. She nodded, gave me a tight hug, and ran inside, leaving me alone on the porch. The night breeze blew through, carrying the chill of autumn. I watched her go, telling myself I was overthinking things. Addison is smart. She knows what she's doing. She'll be fine. The weeks that followed felt like Addison had stepped into an entirely different world. She began talking about cocktail parties in downtown Richmond, where glittering chandeliers cast soft light, the soulful notes of jazz mingled with the scent of expensive perfume. "Landon, you should see those places," she said, her eyes sparkling like stars. "The people there live like they're in a movie." One time I was invited to a penthouse in the West End, overlooking the James River. Crystal glasses, red wine, and everyone talking about art, architecture, as if the whole world is a canvas for them to paint. I listened, nodding, but inside I couldn't help but feel a mix of awe and unease. My Addison, the girl who used to sit on the porch sketching with a cup of Mom's tea, was now enthralled by a dazzling, unfamiliar world, one that shimmered, but was also full of traps. She began to change, not abruptly, but in small, accumulating ways. Gone were the loose t-shirts and worn-out jeans. Instead, she wore fitted dresses, elegant high heels, and her hair was meticulously curled. She started wearing small, sparkling earrings, the kind I was certain didn't fit the salary of a budding interior designer. "A client gave them to me," she said with a laugh when I asked, her voice light as if it were no big deal. But I noticed her eyes flicker away, as if she knew I wouldn't be satisfied with that answer. She came home later, sometimes past midnight. Her phone buzzed constantly with messages that she read and giggled at but never shared with me. When I asked, she'd say, "Just work, Landon. I'm collaborating with Vincent. He has some great ideas." Vincent. His name appeared more and more in her stories, like a recurring melody I couldn't stop hearing, no matter how much it unsettled me. I was happy for her, truly. Her eyes shone brighter. Her smile was more radiant, as if she were living in a beautiful dream. But every time she mentioned Vincent, a quiet alarm went off inside me, like a warning bell ringing in the silence. I told Addison I wanted to meet Vincent. She agreed. That day, Vincent showed up looking like he'd stepped out of a fashion magazine. A perfectly tailored gray suit, slicked back hair, and a confident smile that made me feel small by comparison. "Landon, pleasure to meet you," he said, shaking my hand with a grip that was firm but cold. "Addison's told me a lot about you. She says you're the best brother she could ask for." I nodded, forcing a smile. "She's told me about you too." We sat down, Addison next to Vincent, her eyes gleaming like a child unwrapping a gift. Vincent talked a lot about Langford Holdings' real estate projects, trips to Europe, and parties he called networking opportunities. His voice was smooth, every sentence polished as if rehearsed in front of a mirror. But something about him felt off. He was too perfect, too polished, like a statue crafted for display. I watched how he looked at Addison, his gaze gentle but occasionally drifting past her, as if she were just a piece of a larger picture he was painting. "Vincent respects me," Addison said later that evening over dinner. "He believes in my talent, says I could do big things. Don't worry, okay? I know what I'm doing." I wanted to believe her, I really did. But when I looked into her eyes, I saw a naivety I hadn't noticed before. She believed Vincent loved her, believed their connection was fate. "He says I'm his inspiration," she told me, her voice dreamy. "He wants to take me to Paris to see design exhibitions." I never thought I'd have a chance like this. I nodded, but inside I couldn't shake the feeling that Addison was walking into a trap laced with danger. Our parents, on the other hand, were thrilled. Mom, with her unwavering faith in goodness, couldn't stop praising him. "Addison's so lucky. Vincent's from the Langford family, the most powerful in Richmond. If he cares about her, that's a blessing." Dad, usually quiet, nodded in agreement. "He seems decent. Addison's talented. She deserves good things." I wanted to shout, to tell them that Vincent's world wasn't ours, that people like him didn't come into our lives without an agenda. But I stayed silent. I didn't want to ruin their happiness or upset Addison. She was living in a dream, and I honestly didn't know what the right thing to do was. About 6 months after Addison started dating Vincent, she began to change in ways that were unsettling. She grew quiet, withdrawn, as if carrying a secret too heavy to share. She still smiled and talked about her design projects, but her smile no longer held its former radiance. Some evenings I found her sitting alone on the porch, her eyes tinged with sadness, as if hiding a burden too great to bear. When I asked, she'd shake her head, saying work was exhausting and she just needed rest. Mom, with her sensitive heart, noticed something was wrong too. "She looks paler, Landon," she whispered as we washed dishes after dinner. "Have you noticed she's eating less?" I nodded but said nothing. I didn't want to worry Mom, but the truth was I was worried to the point that my heart felt like it was being squeezed every time I looked into Addison's eyes. One afternoon when I came home from work, I found Addison sitting at the dining table, clutching a mug of tea, her gaze distant. "Landon," she said, her voice so soft I had to strain to hear, "I need to tell you something." My heart pounded as if I already knew what she was about to say would change everything. She took a deep breath, then whispered, I'm pregnant." The world around me seemed to stop. I stared at her, unsure of what to say. Joy, fear, and anger swirled in my mind. "Does Vincent know?" I asked, my voice dry. She nodded, her eyes red and teary. He panicked, Landon. He said it's not the right time, that his family won't accept it. They want me to take care of it." "Take care of it?" I repeated, feeling my blood boil. "What do you mean, Addison? What do they want you to do?" But I already knew the answer. I saw it in her eyes, the pain, the desperation, the fear. Her voice trembled as she explained that Vincent had taken her to a small office in the city, where a stranger in a black suit handed her a thick envelope of cash. "They told me to go to a clinic on the outskirts," she said, tears streaming down her cheeks. "They said if I keep the baby, it'll cause a scandal. They won't let that happen. They threatened me, Landon." My fists clenched, nails digging into my palms until they stung. "Threatened you how?" I asked, struggling to keep my voice calm, though inside I wanted to storm to Vincent's house and wipe that fake smile off his face. Addison shook her head, her voice choking. "They said if I don't do it, they'll make sure I lose my job, lose everything. They know who our parents are, they know about you. They said they could hurt our family." I shot to my feet, the chair toppling behind me. "They dare," I growled, but Addison grabbed my hand, her eyes pleading. "Landon, don't. Please don't make a scene, I'm begging you. I'll handle this. I need you to be here for me." I looked at her, my heart breaking. My strong, radiant sister now seemed so small, so fragile, like a dried leaf that could crumble in the wind. I wanted to hold her, to tell her everything would be okay, but I knew it would be a lie. Nothing was okay. The next day, Addison was gone all morning. Her phone was unreachable, and when I called her office, they said she'd taken the day off. Mom was frantic, nearly in tears, while Dad sat silently staring into the distance as if avoiding the truth. I drove all over Richmond, from Carytown to the West End, searching every place she loved. By late afternoon, when I was nearly at my wit's end, she called. "Landon, I'm home. I'm okay." But she wasn't okay. When I got home, she was on the couch, wrapped tightly in a blanket, her face pale as paper. "I did it," she whispered, avoiding my eyes. "They took me to a clinic on the outskirts. A cold, nameless place. They told me not to tell anyone." I knelt in front of her, reaching for her hand, but she pulled away as if my touch hurt her. "I wanted to keep the baby, Landon," she said, her voice breaking. I thought about it, about being a mother, about having a family. But they didn't give me a choice. "Vincent," he cried. "He said he didn't want this, but his family. They're too powerful." My blood surged with rage. "Was Vincent there?" I asked, my voice trembling with anger. She shook her head. "No, just his people. They drove me there, gave me money, and told me to forget it ever happened." She broke down, sobbing as she clung to me, and I held her tightly, feeling her tremble like a knife cutting into my heart. "I'm sorry, Landon," she said. "I didn't want you to worry. I didn't know what to do. I wanted to storm out, to find Vincent and his family, to tear apart the glamorous world that had crushed my sister." But Addison gripped my hand, her eyes pleading. "It's over, Landon. Please. If you do anything, they won't leave us alone. I just want to forget this. Please." I clenched my jaw, trying to suppress the fury burning in my chest. I nodded, but inside I knew I couldn't forget. In the days that followed, our home felt suffocating. Mom noticed Addison wasn't herself, but she didn't ask, perhaps afraid of the answer. Dad remained silent, but I saw the pain in his eyes, as if he knew he was powerless. As for me, I couldn't sleep. Each night I lay in bed, listening to the ticking clock, thinking of my sister, the child that would never be born, and the terrifying power of the Langford family. I wanted to act, to stand up, but Addison's pleas echoed in my mind, holding me back. After the abortion, Addison was no longer the radiant girl who used to sketch on the porch. She quit her job at the design firm, saying she needed time to rest. But I knew that wasn't true. She stopped drawing, stopped talking about her dream of opening Hayes Interiors. Her room became a dark sanctuary, with the curtains always drawn, and the sketches she once cherished now lay scattered on the floor, gathering dust. She cut off contact with her friends, ignored messages, and didn't answer calls. Whenever I knocked on her door, she'd respond in a frail voice, "I'm fine, Landon. I just want to be alone." But she wasn't fine. I saw her wasting away, her eyes shadowed with dark circles, and her smile, the light of our home, was gone. One winter evening, as a light snow dusted the porch, I found her standing in the backyard, staring up at the gray sky. I walked over, saying nothing, just standing beside her. "Landon," she whispered, her voice like a fleeting breeze. "I thought I was stronger than this." But I was wrong. I wanted to hug her, to tell her she wasn't wrong, that the ones at fault were Vincent and his family. But before I could speak, she turned and went back inside, leaving me with a heavy sense of helplessness. Then Vincent came back. I don't know how he got in touch with her, but one day I saw him standing at our door, still in his impeccable suit, though his eyes lacked their former confidence. He apologized, his voice sweet as honey. "Addison, I was wrong," I overheard him say from the hallway, struggling to contain my anger. "My family pressured me. I didn't want to hurt you. I love you truly. Give me another chance." I wanted to storm out and throw him out, but Addison, with her soft heart, believed him. She cried, embraced him, and I saw her come alive again, as if she'd found a flicker of light in the darkness. "He promised to change, Landon," she told me later, her eyes sparkling with hope. "He's sincere. I believe this time will be different." I didn't believe it, but I couldn't stop her. She loved Vincent, loved him blindly, and I knew any warning from me would only push her further away. So I stayed silent, but with each passing day I felt like I was watching her walk a tightrope over an abyss. Their relationship resumed, but in secrecy. She met him in private, coming home with eyes that were both happy and anxious. Vincent was charming when he was with her, taking her to fancy restaurants, giving her expensive gifts. But then he'd turn cold, disappearing for weeks, leaving her with unanswered messages and long nights waiting in the dark. I saw the cycle repeat, a cruel loop she couldn't escape. The following summer, on a swelteringly unbearable day when the sun blazed through the oak trees, I found her vomiting in the bathroom. Her face pale, her hands trembling as she clutched her stomach. "I'm pregnant again, Landon. I don't know what to do," she cried, her voice breaking. "Vincent says he's not ready to go public. He told me to handle it quietly." I grabbed her shoulders, trying to keep my voice steady. "Addison, you can't do this again. You can't let them keep controlling you." But she shook her head, tears falling uselessly. "He promised it'll be different next time. I just need to trust him one more time." She cried all night, but in the end, she listened to Vincent. I drove her to the clinic, each step feeling like it carried the weight of 1,000 pounds. I sat in the waiting room, listening to the cold hum of machines from behind the door, my heart shattering with every second. When she came out, her eyes were empty, as if a piece of her soul had been taken. "It'll be different next time," she whispered, but her voice held no life. And then, when fall returned and the oak leaves turned golden again, Vincent came back like a snake slithering out after a storm. He gave her a ring, a sparkling diamond, and promised to marry her. "I told my family," he said, his voice full of conviction. "They'll accept you. We'll have a future together." Addison believed him, clinging to his words like a drowning person grasping at a lifeline. She smiled again, started talking about a wedding, a small house in the suburbs. I wanted to believe this time would be different, but deep down, I knew it wasn't that simple. By the end of that year, Addison moved out. She told us she wanted to focus on her career, that she'd rented a small apartment in the Manchester district to start over. Mom cried, Dad nodded silently, and I just looked at her, knowing it wasn't the truth. She wanted distance to escape our worried gazes and perhaps to hold on to a shred of hope that she could raise a child if given the chance. But that chance never came. Over the next 4 years, Addison became pregnant 5 times. And all 5 times she was forced to terminate the pregnancies. The 5th abortion took away her ability to ever become a mother. One afternoon, Addison called home, her voice strangely soft. "Landon, I want to come home for dinner. It's been a while." I let out a sigh of relief, but a bad feeling clung to me like a shadow. When she walked into the house, I saw her smile, but it wasn't real. It was like a hastily painted picture, hiding the pain beneath. Mom hugged her, crying, while Dad just held her hand, silent. Dinner felt strange. Addison talked a lot, reminiscing about our childhood, about the cardboard wings I made for her. She laughed, but her eyes were empty, as if she were saying goodbye. After dinner, she stood up, hugged each of us tightly. "I love you all," she said, then left. I wanted to hold her back, to ask what she was thinking, but I just stood there watching her walk out the door. The next morning, as I stepped into the garage to get my car for work, I saw a small envelope on my old workbench, surrounded by tools and the familiar smell of engine oil. Addison's trembling handwriting on the envelope made my heart pound, as if someone had punched me in the chest. I tore it open, scanning the few short lines. "Landon, if you're reading this, please forgive me. Thank you for always loving me. I'm sorry I wasn't strong enough." I called her, but no one answered. I threw the phone down, jumped into my car, and sped to the Manchester district, rain pouring down like it wanted to swallow everything. I pounded on her apartment door, shouting her name, but there was no response. The door was locked, but I didn't think twice. I rammed it with my shoulder, and the old wooden door creaked and gave way. Inside, I found her lying on the floor, surrounded by unfinished sketches next to an empty bottle of sleeping pills. "Addison!" I dropped to my knees, held her, shook her, but she was still, her breathing faint. I called for an ambulance, my hands shaking so badly I nearly dropped the phone. "Please, hurry. My sister, she needs help." The ambulance took her to St. Mary's Hospital, the same place where she had endured unspeakable pain. I sat in the waiting room, hands clenched, praying like I'd never prayed before. The doctors said she was lucky to be found in time, but she had slipped into a temporary coma due to the overdose. I sat by her bedside, looking at her pale face, the once radiant features now shrouded in a haze. I held her hand, whispering, "Addison, I'm here. I'll always be here." While cleaning out her apartment, I found a worn leather journal under her bed. I opened it, and each page felt like a knife to my heart. She wrote about her years of torment with Vincent, the empty promises, the nights she cried alone, the guilt over the children who were never born, and her longing for forgiveness, though she had done nothing wrong. The final line, written in shaky blue ink, read, "If there's another life, I just want to be ordinary. No wrong loves, no misplaced trust." I closed the journal, tears falling onto the pages, and for the first time I broke down. Not out of sadness, but anger. Anger at Vincent, at the Langford family, and at myself for failing to protect my sister. From that moment, I knew I was no longer the gentle brother. Her journal, those agonizing words, had ignited a fire in me. I swore I would seek justice for Addison, that I would make the Langford family pay for what they had done. I was no longer afraid, no longer hesitant. Vincent and his family had turned my sister into a shadow, and I would not let them continue to bask in their false glow. The days that followed made St. Mary's Hospital a part of my life. I stayed by Addison's bedside, only leaving when Mom or Dad came to take my place. Mom sat there, holding her hand, whispering prayers, but her eyes were filled with fear, as if she knew this story was far from over. Dad, as usual, was quieter, but his hands trembled as he stroked Addison's hair. "Will she be okay, Landon?" he asked me once, his voice so low I had to strain to hear it. I nodded, though I wasn't sure. All I knew was that to save Addison's soul, I had to act. I started with the smallest clues. Addison's journal was my starting point. Those pages filled with pain, documenting every false promise from Vincent, every time she was forced into those cold clinics. I kept it carefully in my bag, both a treasure and a weapon. I knew that to bring the Langford family into the light, I needed undeniable evidence, something their money couldn't bury. I wasn't a lawyer or a detective, just a mechanical engineer with rough hands and a burning heart. But I would find a way. I returned to St. Mary's not as a patient's family member, but as someone searching for the truth. I spoke to nurses who had cared for Addison during her hospital visits. Most avoided me, their eyes nervous, but one older nurse, Ruth, with silver hair and sharp eyes, pulled me into a corner of the hallway. "What do you want to know, young man?" she asked, her voice low but cautious. I told her briefly about Addison, about her visits, about the Langfords. She sighed, glancing around as if afraid someone might overhear. "I shouldn't say this," she whispered, "but I've seen girls like your sister. They come here, get taken care of, and then disappear. Large sums of money hit the hospital's accounts right after. The Langford name shows up in the records, but no one dares ask." My blood surged with anger. "Do you have proof?" I asked, my voice almost pleading. She shook her head. "Records get altered or erased, but if you dig deep, you'll find something. Be careful, young man. People like the Langfords don't like being touched." I nodded, thanked her, and left with a sliver of hope, but also a new fear that I was facing a monster far bigger than I'd imagined. I knew I couldn't do this alone. I needed someone experienced, fearless, and unafraid of power. That's when I thought of Stella Jennings, a reporter who had been sued by Langford Holdings years ago for exposing their financial scandals in an article for the Richmond Times-Dispatch. I tracked her down through an old article, and after a few calls met her at a small diner in Shockoe Bottom, where the smell of coffee mingled with the bustle of the streets. Stella looked tougher than I'd expected. Short silver-dyed hair, piercing eyes, and a wry smile that suggested she'd seen too much of the world's filth. "What do you want, Landon Hayes?" she asked, sipping her coffee. "I don't like wasting time." I pulled out Addison's journal and slid it across the table. "Read this," I said. "My sister nearly died because of the Langfords. I need your help to bring them down." Stella flipped through the pages, her expression shifting from curiosity to anger. When she closed the journal, she looked at me, her voice low. "Do you know who you're up against? Langford Holdings isn't just a company. They're a system. Money, power, and dirty secrets. But I'll help you. Not for you, but for this girl." She pointed at the journal. "She deserves justice." Stella and I got to work. We returned to St. Mary's, seeking out former staff who might know something. A young nurse, Marla Green, agreed to talk after Stella promised to protect her identity. Marla, her voice trembling, said she'd seen Addison brought into surgery outside normal procedures. "There was a doctor brought in from out of town," she said. "They called it a special case. I saw money change hands right after, and her records were altered." I wanted to say something, but I was afraid of losing my job. Stella took meticulous notes while I clenched my fists, trying to contain my rage. We dug deeper, investigating Langford Holdings' financial transactions. Stella had a contact at a bank who agreed to provide unofficial information. We uncovered large payments to St. Mary's coinciding with Addison's hospital visits. "This isn't a coincidence," Stella said, her eyes gleaming like a hunter catching a scent. "They're covering their tracks. But we need more than this to take them down." The Langfords, however, were not an easy opponent. Stella warned me they might already know we were investigating. "They have eyes and ears everywhere," she said. "Be careful. Don't let them know you have that journal." I nodded, but inside I knew this fight wouldn't be easy. I wasn't just up against Vincent or his family, but an entire network of power built on money and silence. One evening, when I returned from meeting Stella, Mom pulled me into the kitchen, her voice trembling. "Landon, what are you doing? Are you trying to take the Langfords to court? They're the most powerful family in Richmond. They won't let this go." Dad stood there, silent, but his eyes were heavy with worry. I looked at them, the people who had sacrificed their lives for me and Addison, and felt my heart tighten. "Mom, Dad," I said, my voice firm, "if I don't do this, no one will. Addison's been through enough. I can't let them go on like nothing happened." Mom cried, hugging me, while Dad just nodded, but I knew he understood. They were scared, but I couldn't stop. Addison's journal, her pleas, and the faint hope in her eyes were all I needed to keep going. Stella and I began preparing a case, gathering financial evidence, Marla's testimony, and pieces from the journal. We knew this was just the first step, but it was the start of a fight to restore Addison's dignity and to break the cycle of sin the Langford family had created. 3 weeks later, Addison was discharged from the hospital at my request. The doctors warned that she needed to avoid stress and required a familiar environment to recover. I brought her back to our home in Chesterfield County, where Mom and Dad had prepared her old room, with a quilt Mom had sewn herself and the paintings Addison made in high school hanging on the walls. But Addison was no longer the girl who used to laugh and joke in that room. She sat silently by the window, her gaze lost, as if looking at a world she no longer belonged to. At night, I heard her jolt awake, screaming from nightmares, and each time I rushed in, held her, and whispered that everything would be okay. But I knew, even though she had survived, a part of her had died in that cold hospital room at St. Mary's. Stella, with the determination of a warrior, kept pushing me forward. We met in discreet places, a small diner on the outskirts, an empty park, to avoid prying eyes. One day, she called me to her small, cluttered office filled with papers and cold coffee cups. "Landon, we've got something," she said, sliding a stack of documents across the desk. They were copies of bank transactions, showing large sums from Langford Holdings flowing into St. Mary's accounts on the exact days Addison was admitted. "This is evidence," Stella said, her voice brimming with excitement. "But we need more to go public. An article, a lawsuit, something to shake them." I nodded, but deep down I knew the Langfords wouldn't sit idly by. Stella was right when she said they had eyes everywhere. Just days later, her first article was published in the Richmond Times-Dispatch, a sharp piece exposing suspicious funding and altered records at St. Mary's. Though Addison's identity was protected, the article sent shockwaves. Questions began circulating on social media, whispers about Langford Holdings spreading through conversations in Richmond. I felt a spark of hope, but also a chill running down my spine. I knew they would retaliate and they wouldn't hold back. Sure enough, the Langfords reacted swiftly like a cornered beast. Robert Langford, Vincent's father, appeared on television calling Stella's article slander and a conspiracy to tarnish our family's honor. Elaine, Vincent's mother, worked behind the scenes, mobilizing a team of top lawyers to sue Stella for defamation. They launched a media campaign, painting Stella as an unemployed reporter fabricating stories for attention. Witnesses who had promised to testify began backing out. Some said they received threatening letters. Others simply vanished from the radar. Marla Green, the nurse who had agreed to testify, called Stella in a panic. "I can't do this anymore," she said. "They know where my son goes to school. I'm sorry." A week later, she was reported as voluntarily missing, and I knew it wasn't true. Stella and I weren't spared either. One night, as I drove home from the machine shop, I noticed a black SUV tailing me for 3 blocks. I sped up, my heart pounding, but the vehicle stayed close, its headlights glaring in my rearview mirror like a warning. When I pulled into a gas station, the SUV vanished, but that night I received an anonymous text. "Keep poking at the Langfords and someone will die for real." I deleted the message, but I couldn't erase the icy dread clinging to me. Stella didn't fare much better. Her car was vandalized in the middle of the night, tires slashed, windows shattered, and a note taped to the steering wheel. "Stop, or you'll regret it." Mom and Dad grew increasingly frantic. One evening when I got home, Mom pulled me into the kitchen, her eyes red from crying. "Landon, stop this," she pleaded. "They'll kill our whole family. Don't you see how powerful they are?" Dad stood there, gripping the edge of the table, his voice low. "Landon, your mother's right. We can't fight them. Addison's home now. That's enough." I looked at them, the people who had devoted their lives to protecting me and Addison, and felt my heart constrict. "Mom, Dad," I said, my voice trembling but resolute, "if I stop, they'll keep hurting others. Addison isn't their only victim. I can't let them win." I thought that was the peak of fear, but I was wrong. One late night, while I was reviewing documents with Stella over the phone, I heard the sound of breaking glass from the garage. I ran out, my heart pounding, only to find the garage door smashed open, my tools ransacked. I called the police, but before they arrived, I smelled smoke. A fire erupted from the corner of the garage, spreading quickly like a ravenous beast. I rushed into the house, shouting for Mom, Dad, and Addison. "Get out! Now!" I broke down Addison's door, pulling her from bed as she coughed, her eyes wild with panic. Neighbors helped drag Mom and Dad out, but Mom suffered minor burns on her hand, and Addison, overcome by smoke, collapsed in my arms. Firefighters arrived, containing the blaze, but our 2-story wooden house, the place filled with memories where Addison once sketched her dream wings, where Mom used to sing lullabies, was reduced to ashes. I knelt in the rubble, holding Addison, feeling like our entire world had been burned away. The police ruled the fire an electrical accident, but I knew the truth. It was a warning from the Langfords, a clear message: stop or lose everything. Mom was taken to the hospital for her burns, and Addison, though she survived, sank deeper into her own darkness. She didn't speak, just clung to me, trembling like a lost child. I moved her and Dad to a nearby motel, but every night I saw Dad staring out the window, his eyes filled with pain. Stella called me the next day, her voice thick with anger. "They think they can scare us into silence," she said. "But they're wrong, Landon. We'll keep going. We'll find more evidence, and we'll make them pay." I nodded, though no one could see, and felt a new resolve rising within me. Stella and I met in an abandoned warehouse on the outskirts of Richmond, a dilapidated place reeking of mildew with slivers of sunlight piercing through cracks in the roof like blades. Stella spread a stack of documents on an old wooden table, her eyes sharp and cold. "They can burn your house, Landon, but they can't burn the truth," she said, pointing at the papers. They were copies of bank transactions, Marla Green's testimony before she vanished, and we both knew we needed something stronger, something undeniable. Stella nodded when I suggested a bold plan: confront Vincent directly and trap him into revealing the truth. I contacted Vincent through a text, pretending I wanted to talk man to settle things. I chose an old bar in Church Hill, where dim lights and soulful blues music cloaked discreet conversations. I knew Vincent loved to show off, and I bet he wouldn't pass up the chance to put me in my place. He showed up, still in his polished suit, but his eyes betrayed tension. "Landon," he said, flashing a fake smile, "I know you're angry, but this has gone too far. Addison needs peace, doesn't she?" I nodded, pouring him a drink, keeping my voice calm despite wanting to punch him in the face. I let him drink, glass after glass, knowing alcohol would loosen his tongue. Stella had hidden a small recorder in my jacket pocket, and I kept the conversation going, circling around Addison and what had happened. "You love her, don't you?" I asked, my voice soft but pointed. Vincent smirked, his eyes glassy from the liquor. "Love? Sure, but she's just a naive girl. My family wouldn't let her ruin everything," he went on, slurring, revealing how his family handled Addison. How they paid off doctors, how they ensured no one would speak out. I gripped my glass, fighting to contain my rage, letting him talk. When he stumbled out onto the sidewalk, I checked the recorder. Every word he said was captured, clear as a blade. I gave the recording to Stella, and she nearly cheered. "This is what we needed, Landon," she said. "He dug his own grave, but we knew the recording alone wasn't enough. We needed more evidence for an undeniable blow." Stella reached out to a women's rights organization experienced in taking on powerful corporations. They agreed to help with all their resources. We compiled all the evidence: Vincent's recording, parts of Addison's journal, and the financial documents from Marla Green. We sent everything to the organization, which uploaded it to an independent website, along with a detailed article recounting Addison's story and those of other Langford victims. Overnight, the story spread like wildfire on social media. The hashtag Langford scandal exploded, racing across forums, posts, and comments. Human rights groups got involved, and women's rights activists organized protests outside Langford Holdings headquarters, holding signs demanding justice. Other stories surfaced: women who had been coerced, threatened, or bribed by the Langfords. I read the words on my phone screen, my heart pounding. "We did it, Stella," I said in a late-night call. She chuckled softly. "Not yet, Landon. This is just the beginning." But the Langfords didn't sit still. They countered with a ruthlessness I hadn't anticipated. Instead of appearing publicly, they operated in the shadows. One morning, I received an anonymous email with a photo of Addison, taken from a distance as she sat in Bird Park, her eyes lost. Attached was a short message. "She's so fragile. Can she handle another round?" My heart stopped. I raced to the motel, checking that she was safe, and found her sitting with Mom, unharmed but fragile. I didn't tell her about the email, not wanting to scare her further, but I hired an old friend from the machine shop, a burly guy named Mike, to watch her from a distance. Meanwhile, the Langfords targeted Stella. They stopped suing directly and instead hired hackers to attack her social media accounts, trying to delete posts tied to #Langford scandal. But thanks to the women's rights organization's secure platform, our data remained safe. Stella, despite the pressure, stayed resolute. "They're trying to ruin me, Landon, but I'm used to it," she said in a call, her voice trembling but determined. "We have the organization behind us. They can't touch us again." Stella and I kept digging. We found a new witness, a former Langford Holdings accountant who had quit after discovering irregular payments to hospitals and charities to clean records. The man, David, agreed to meet us at a small cafe in the Fan District, but only after Stella promised to protect his identity. David, his face lined with wrinkles and his eyes anxious, handed us a USB drive with financial data he'd secretly copied before leaving the company. "I don't want to be involved," he said, his voice shaking. "But what they did, it's not right. There were other girls, not just your sister." The data on the USB was a goldmine: detailed transactions, internal emails among the Langford family, and notes about handling cases like Addison's. Reading it felt suffocating, but a sense of triumph began to creep in. "This is it," Stella said, her eyes gleaming. "With this, we can take them to court." Stella contacted a nonprofit legal organization specializing in protecting abuse victims, with ties to independent prosecutors beyond the Langfords' influence. We met them in a small office in downtown Richmond, where a young lawyer named Eden listened to our story and reviewed the recording and David's data. "This is a big case," she said, her expression serious. "But we'll help you. We need more witnesses, and we need to prepare for a public lawsuit." Stella nodded, and I felt a new spark of hope. Eden introduced us to a group of activists willing to help find other Langford victims to strengthen our case. Eden and the activists worked tirelessly. They scoured social media posts and anonymous comments under the #Langford scandal, uncovering 3 other women who had endured experiences similar to Addison's. One was a former Langford Holdings employee, forced to terminate a pregnancy after a brief relationship with an executive. Another was a secretary, threatened with job loss if she didn't handle her pregnancy. The third, a young woman who had worked at a Langford hotel, said she was silenced after accusing Vincent of assault. Hearing their stories felt like a stranglehold on my heart, but it also fueled my anger. Addison wasn't the only victim, and that only strengthened my resolve. We met these women in a discreet room at Eden's office, where fluorescent lights illuminated their wounded faces. They trembled as they shared their stories, but their eyes flickered with a spark of resilience. "I thought I was the only one," one woman, Emma, whispered, her voice choking. "I stayed silent out of fear, but if that girl, your sister, can stand up, so can I." I took her hand, thanked her, and in my heart I thought of Addison, how she, despite her fragility, had become an inspiration to others. With Eden's support, we built an airtight case combining Vincent's recording, David's financial data, Marla Green's testimony, and the stories of the new victims. Stella kept writing, turning these details into razor-sharp articles published on independent platforms and shared by human rights organizations. Each article was a dagger into the Langfords' wall of power, and this time, that wall began to crack. Langford Holdings investors started pulling out, their stock plummeting on the exchange. Protests outside their headquarters grew, with signs reading "Justice for Victims" and "Langfords must pay." I stood among the crowd once, watching angry faces, feeling a mix of pride and pain. This was Addison's fight, but also the fight for everyone they had trampled. The Langfords, however, fought back. They hired a new PR team, releasing propaganda videos where Vincent appeared remorseful, claiming he was misunderstood and trying to make amends. He cried on television, talking about his love for Addison and how he was pressured by his family. I wanted to smash the screen, but Stella held me back. "Let him perform," she said coldly. "Every lie he tells just makes people angrier." She was right. Social media posts began mocking Vincent, calling him a fraud, and his old friends who once praised him turned their backs. He became an outcast even in his own glamorous world. Meanwhile, Addison slowly regained some life. She started talking more, though her voice remained weak. One afternoon, when I took her to Eden's office to meet the activists, she held my hand, her eyes brighter than I'd seen since she woke up. "Landon," she said, "I don't know if I'm worth all this, but I'm proud of you." I hugged her, feeling like my heart had been reignited. "You're why I started, Addison," I whispered, "and I won't stop until they pay." The lawsuit was finally filed in federal court, a move Eden called no turning back. The independent prosecutor, a tough woman named Ellen, reviewed our case and agreed to take it to trial. "This isn't just about Addison," she said, her voice resolute. "It's about a system of abuse protected by money and power. We'll make them answer." A surge of electricity ran through me. For the first time, I believed justice wasn't just a dream. The trial took place in a small but stifling courtroom in downtown Richmond, where sunlight filtered through heavy curtains, casting shadows on the wooden floor. Robert Langford, in an expensive suit and an arrogant gaze, sat at the defendant's table, but I noticed his hands tremble slightly as the charges were read. He was indicted for bribery, coercion, and covering up crimes. Vincent, beside his father, looked like a shadow of himself, his face pale, his eyes avoiding contact. Elaine, his mother, didn't appear, but I knew she was pulling strings from afar, trying to save their crumbling empire. The most pivotal day was when Addison testified. I begged her not to, fearing she couldn't handle the pressure, but she held my hand, her voice steady. "Landon, I need to do this. Not for me, but for the others." As she walked into the courtroom, she looked frail, her pale green dress hanging loosely on her thin frame, but her eyes burned with a strength I'd never seen. She told her story, her voice trembling but clear, about the forced abortions, the threats, the night Vincent assaulted her. When she said, I don't want them to die. I just want them to know what fear feels like." The courtroom fell silent. I sat in the back row, tears falling quietly, not from sadness but from pride. My broken sister stood up like a warrior. The trial stretched for weeks with other witnesses. Emma, the secretary, the hotel worker, testifying one by one. Each story was another dagger into the Langford empire. Vincent's recording played in court, his cold, cruel voice echoing, making even his own lawyer bow his head. David's data, along with Marla Green's testimony, found after she fled to another state, was undeniable evidence. Robert Langford tried to justify himself, but his voice faltered as Ellen, the prosecutor, pressed him, exposing every bribe, every covered-up email. Finally, the verdict came. Robert was sentenced to 5 years in prison for bribery and coercion. Langford Holdings was fined millions, and the company declared bankruptcy shortly after as investors pulled out entirely. Vincent escaped prison but was shunned by the community, his reputation reduced to ashes. I heard he left Richmond, living in obscurity somewhere alone. Elaine tried to salvage things, but she too faded from the spotlight, leaving behind a once powerful family, now just an empty shell. We returned to the motel where Mom and Dad were waiting. Mom sat in an old armchair, her hands clasped tightly, her eyes still filled with worry despite my recounting of the courtroom victory. Dad stood by the window, gazing out at the empty street as if expecting our 2-story wooden house to rise from the ashes. When Addison walked in, Mom burst into tears and ran to embrace her. "My baby," she sobbed, stroking Addison's hair as she did when she was a child. "I'm sorry. I'm so sorry I didn't protect you." Dad turned, his eyes red, and for the first time in my life I saw him kneel before Addison, taking her hand. "I was scared for too long," he said, his voice choked. "I left you alone." "I'm sorry, my girl." Addison looked at them, her eyes glistening with tears, but she shook her head. "Mom, Dad, it's not your fault," she whispered. "You weren't cruel, just cowardly. And sometimes cowardice kills too." Her words cut like a knife, not out of blame, but because they were the raw, painful truth. I stood there watching my family and felt my heart tighten. We had defeated the Langfords, but the cost was scars that would never heal. I took Addison's hand, pulling her to sit beside me. "You don't need to apologize," I said, my voice low but firm. "We did the right thing. And from now on, we'll rebuild. Not just for you, but for all of us." She nodded, but her eyes carried a deep sadness, as if she knew that, despite justice being served, what she had lost, her unborn children, her to be a mother, and a piece of her soul, would never return. In the days that followed, Addison began to change, slowly. She started volunteering, meeting women who had been abused, listening to their stories and sharing her own, not for pity, but to inspire. I watched her stand before a group of women at a community center, her voice trembling but powerful. "I lost so much," she said, "but I learned we don't have to stay silent. We can stand up, and we can win." The women clapped, some cried, and I stood in the corner of the room, tears falling silently. My Addison was back, not the radiant girl of the past, but a strong woman forged from pain. I decided to use the compensation from the lawsuit for something meaningful. After many sleepless nights, I opened a support center for victims of coercion in Richmond, naming it Haven House, a safe place for people like Addison where they could find help, be heard, and have a chance to start over. Mom and Dad began to change too. Mom got involved with the center, cooking meals for the women who came for help, and I saw her rediscover joy in caring for others. Dad, though still quiet, started helping me fix up the center, using the hands that once worked on railroads to rebuild walls as if he were rebuilding our family. One afternoon, as Addison and I sat in the small office of Haven House, she pulled out an old sketch, a drawing of the dream house she had designed back when she worked at the design firm. "I used to think I'd build a house like this," she said, her voice wistful. "But now I think I want to build places like Haven House, not just for me, but for everyone who needs it." I smiled, taking her hand. "You've already done it, kid. And I'll always be here building with you." A year later, Addison and I stood on the shore of Virginia Beach, a place she'd once said she wanted to visit with me when we were young. The sea breeze blew through, carrying the scent of salt and a sense of freedom, tangling her long hair, now neatly tied with a thin scarf. She wore a light gray sweater, her arms wrapped around herself as if to hold on to a bit of warmth in the chilly afternoon. I stood beside her, watching the waves crash against the shore, steady like the heartbeat of a world in constant motion. "I can finally breathe without feeling guilty," Addison whispered, her voice soft but certain, a faint smile on her lips. Not as radiant as it once was, but genuine, like sunlight breaking through clouds after a storm. Our new home on the outskirts of Richmond, made possible by the lawsuit settlement, had become a place of healing. It wasn't grand, not like the mansions Addison once designed, but it was ours. A modest house with a porch full of Mom's white daisies and young oak trees stretching upward in the yard. Mom, having found some peace, often sat on the porch each morning brewing tea and looking out at the garden, her eyes no longer clouded with worry. Dad, whose hands once trembled with helplessness, started working at a nearby carpentry shop, crafting chairs and tables for Haven House. "To make up for the days I stayed silent," he told me once, his voice low but meaningful, his eyes glinting with a resolve I'd never seen before. I nodded, hugged him, and felt the change in him. Not a grand transformation, but small, steady steps, like the way our family was rebuilding itself. The bond between Addison and me was the fire that kept me standing. She was the reason I started this fight, and now, she was the reason I kept going. Every time I saw her stand before the women at Haven House, sharing her story with a trembling but resilient voice, I knew our connection wasn't just about protection. It was a promise that we would never abandon each other, no matter how the world tried to tear us apart. Silence, I realized, carried a heavy price. Mom and Dad's fear, my hesitation, and the times Addison chose to stay quiet with Vincent, all left scars that could never be erased. But that silence taught me that every moment we don't speak up is an opportunity for evil to persist. I thought of the women who stood up in court, those who had been afraid but chose to speak, and I understood that their right to live, to be respected, Addison's right, was something no one had the power to take away. One evening, as Addison and I sat on the porch of our new home under the flickering streetlights of the quiet street, she pulled out her old, worn journal, still cherished like a treasure. "Landon," she said, her voice soft but clear, "I thought I'd never get through this. But you, Mom, Dad, and Haven House, you all saved me." I looked at her, tears falling silently, and said, "No, kid. You saved yourself. I was just along for the ride." I sat beside her, gazing at the star-filled sky, the stars twinkling like small flames in the darkness. "No one has the right to stay silent in the face of wrong," I said, my voice low but firm. "Because every silence buries another life." Addison nodded, set her pencil down, and rested her head on my shoulder. "You're right," she whispered, "and I won't be silent anymore." Our story didn't end in a blazing triumph, but in small steps, moments of healing, and a promise to keep fighting, not just for ourselves, but for everyone who needed a voice. Justice may come late, but it never loses its voice. Haven House would be a guiding light, and our new home, though simple, would forever be the place where our family found each other again after all the pain and loss.